I'm going to tell you a story you probably never heard before, or one that you thought you heard before, but only knew a certain part or perspective from public school education. This is a story of both capitalism and revolution, all in one breath. The story I'm about to tell you may surprise you. It may disgust you, make you feel angry, or feel lied to. You're probably wondering why you never really heard something like this before. What I'm about to tell you is a true story of our country, America, and its venture into capitalism. Why a young country under the shadow empire of Great Britain could eclipse its power and legacy in barely over 150 years. As much as what I'm about to tell you may stir your emotions, I wanted to enlighten you in a true sense of patriotism to one of the real reasons why our country was founded. And it's one of the most suppressed history of our nation. What I'm about to tell you is how money was the prime reason for the revolution.
In 1776, the American Revolution began as the American colonies desperately wanted to remove itself from England and its oppressive monarchy. Although numerous reasons are cited for the revolution, one specifically sticks out as the prime cause: that King George III of England forbid the colonies interest-free, independent currency the colonies were creating themselves, due to legislation from England's Parliament forcing the American colonies to borrow money from the Bank of England, immediately making economic hardship and burden. As one can see, there are many quotes from people at that time, including founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin, citing money as the prime reason for the revolution. When you're first taught in school about the American Revolution, students only really get shown the military and moral constitutional aspects of the war. How often is it heard that the Revolutionary War was fought over taxation without representation? Instead, the true phrase should be the Revolutionary War was fought over representation, taxation, and inflation. They show you throwing of the tea in the Boston Harbor. They show you the Boston Massacre. But the school and education systems never really talk about the economic or monetary view of the revolution, for it's a much more telling story. That the American history has always been an anthology of an ongoing battle with the privately controlled Bank of England. Currency wars between the colonies and Great Britain is the greatest little-known history of our nation that was the boiling point multiple decades prior that sparked the Revolutionary War. But how much do we really know about paper money's influence in the revolution? Looking at different scholars on the subject, there are three main arguments made by scholars relating to reasons for inflation in the colonies. Varying opinions are heavy British levying or heavy British taxes to finance wars all over the world, the Currency Acts of 1751 and 1764, and the colonial debt of the colonies trying to finance the Revolutionary War for their independence. All made money a huge influence on the values of the Constitution and the importance of a gold standard. In my research, I argue that paper money and currency is the main contention of the American Revolution, influencing debt, money, banking, capitalism, as well as the gold standard, using 18th century-old primary resources of John Kean, the first cashier of the First Bank of the United States, as well as secondary resources from scholars. Also with me, I'm interviewing a Revolutionary War expert and historian and Dean of Liberal Arts at Kean University, Dr. Mercantini, with both of us concluding that the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 could be looked at as one war. This is the Hidden Hands of History podcast, finding diamonds in the rough of history that have become neglected or forgotten. The story of capitalism is both broad and complex. To start, we need to talk about the creation of paper money, and no, not in China, but in North America. Paper money was looked at as a very American idea at the time, when Europe was mostly using gold and silver for exchange. The American colony's popularity with paper money all started from experimentation in the state of Massachusetts. Historically, Massachusetts is known for being the state birthed with the nation's first National Guard dating back to 1636. With over 375 years of service, its history predates the country's independence, all relates to Britain's long history of borrowing large amounts of troops from the colony. Even after, Massachusetts gave more in proportion to its soldiers than any other state in both land and sea during the Revolutionary War. But in 1690, Massachusetts became the first state birthed with the creation of paper money out of pure necessity, economic survival, and completely by accident. Massachusetts was pressured by Imperial British military authorities that were taking colonial troops from Massachusetts to fight the French in Canada. Unsuited for the weather, when survivors came home, defeated, diseased, the government had no money to pay them. Massachusetts was broke, with no money to carry out simple, everyday needs of commerce or simple acts of government for infrastructure. This was because of such scarce amounts of silver in circulation in the colony barely gave the population any means of exchange. Cultural historian and Harvard Law professor Christine Dezen emphasizes this event as a result upon the state's heavy financial stress ignited upon years of substantial levying or British taxes to finance their wars.
So in 1690 in Massachusetts, basically the British wanted to fight the French in Canada. So they used, Imperials came into basically Massachusetts and wanted militia to go fight. They took these men and they brought them to fight. These guys lost. They came home with smallpox. They were just tired, beaten men. And basically, they asked the government to pay us back for our, for the war struggles. The government had no money because of heavy levying on British taxes, to the point where everyday procedures, the state of Massachusetts couldn't provide roads or even really put a system of exchange for its people. What the angry citizens and angry soldiers did is it pushed the legislation so much that they issued IOUs, promissory notes, essentially, just to pay these people back, and it was only redeemable and whoever held them to pay taxes. I know this seems like not exactly like our paper money today, but this actually was the start. Since there were no silver and no gold to be used in the colony, this was the start of exchange that basically let us to escape taxes on a British dollar from Bank of England. So why do you think, from what you heard traditionally, why do you think that we hear more about military history with instead of economic history with the Revolution?
Well, I mean, I think military history sells, and so that's a piece of it. Armies keep really good records. I mean, if you've looked at Washington's correspondence, and Washington is writing all the time. Hamilton, of course, is famously writing all the time. But armies have to have really good records, right? And so whether it's who's getting paid and when are they getting paid, or what supplies are we paying for, and all of that. So to a certain extent, historians are going to go to where the sources are, and the sources are with the military stuff. And so it's the easier route, right? I do think that there's an argument, and we've seen this with the historiography. I mean, there's the military history, and then there's kind of the ideological interpretation, which has largely remained the dominant interpretation of the American Revolution, with a couple of exceptions, which I gather from what you've introduced this as is looking at a more the progressive school, right, where it's really the economic factors and the economic motivations that pushed the founding fathers and the country along with them to make that decision for revolution. So, those are there's that ideological school and then the economic school, which are kind of the two prevailing ones, and they each kind of ebb and flow, but certainly the economic one can be a little uncomfortable in some ways. It doesn't always match up to what we want America to be, what we want the American past to be.
Right, and I definitely agree. The military sells. The economics a bit nerdy. It's a bit boring.
Well, and the economic stuff is it's complicated. It's a harder. I mean, you've been in Liberty Hall. You've kind of track that stuff and the sources that we have here and matching them up with the secondary literature that exists, it's a bit harder to understand than the Army was here on this day and it went here on this day and got beat by the British on this day
exactly.
and this was the result of that. So, but at the same time, I mean, economic motivation, I think, is something that people understand, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who it's hard to say, oh, I'm motivated by some abstract notion of liberty, or I'm angry that the British Parliament 2,000 miles away is ruling me in a way that was being ruled very differently than we think of a central government today.
Absolutely.
As opposed to saying, my livelihood was at stake, or my ability to make money, my ability to acquire land for my kids, that American idea of we want our kids to have a better life than we had. I mean, that's really rooted in economics. There's a safety issue and other kinds of things, but it's rooted in economics. And so it's interesting, I think, that we struggle to think of economic causes, but at the same time, we can really understand an economic motivation.
Right. And it shows you how complicated the war really was, because you have the military and then you have the economic, and they really should be almost harmonious in their view of looking at each other. And it's I think in the future, make more of that in light of something that is important to look at.
Look, history's complicated, and it should be. These are human beings, and it's hard to know exactly what, we only have a small part of the story that we can recover. So it's hard for us to have a full understanding of what's going on with them. So it should be a complicated story, but it's, conveying that complicated story to a group of fourth graders or a group of 11th graders or a group of adults, and particularly when it doesn't match up with what they earlier heard, it can be hard to kind of break through that prior knowledge and get them to think critically about it and to think differently about it.
Right. You definitely don't want them getting depressed on British rule in fourth grade. That's a little too harsh for a little kid. So basically, it just shows you that a lot of, also with the military, there's constitutional morals. I mean, how many times have you heard that the revolution was over taxation without representation? Even though that's true, I would like to add that inflation basically was also part of that.
Now, you're saying Massachusetts wanted to be free as a colony and be a free commonwealth, free from England. Did all of these colonies back then want that? Which ones were more in favor of rebellion?
The New England colonies rallied to the support of Massachusetts by sending troops in from New Hampshire, and Maine didn't exist then. It was part of Massachusetts. Connecticut did. But it was the rest of the colonies gathered and voted in support for Massachusetts, but totally political support, no military support at this time.
But then, how did the revolution begin in 1775?
Well, you're right. It's 75, not 76. The bloodiest battle in the war is fought in June of 1775 at the Battle of Bunker Hill.
What were they fighting for then? Were they fighting for independence?
The Massachusetts people were fighting for their own independence because martial law had been declared in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or the colony then of Massachusetts, and they had troops stationed there. And so, ahead of all the other colonies, Massachusetts believes that it needs to free itself of this ogre. And
well, so we're not really one country.
No, we're not.
Different colonies with different desires at this point.
They're different nation states even. They think of themselves as coherent, different. When Jefferson was in the Continental Congress, he said he always wanted to go back to his country.
Which was
Virginia.
Because at first, paper money is looked at as a very good thing. It stabilizes all the states' problems. And then eventually with the war, you print so much of it, it becomes worthless.
Right.
After the stabilization in Massachusetts, other states soon followed in their experimentation with paper money, leading into a domino effect as such states as New Jersey, New York, New Hampshire, Connecticut, as well as others producing their own paper money, giving stability and prosperity in full swing to the colonies by 1720s and 30s. In Pennsylvania, paper money helped stabilize the economy, so well in fact that April 3rd, 1729, Benjamin Franklin wrote a pamphlet entitled The Nature and Necessity of Paper Currency, as a response to the solution of the money scarcity exacerbated by British taxes or levying. The pamphlet's creation was influenced by Franklin's debates with the Pennsylvania's governor Patrick Gordon. Franklin was inspired and thought his points were so valid and important they needed to be written down and shared with the public. One of his quotes is from the book Nature and Necessities of Paper Currency.
We have seen many of the many heavy disadvantages a country such as ours must labor under, when not a sufficient stock of running cash to manage its trade. Likewise, we see some advantages which accrue from having money sufficient or plentiful currency. Plentiful currency encourages great number of laboring and handcraftsmen to come and settle into this country, by the same reason that a want of it will discourage and drive them out.
Franklin not only printed his money, owning the Poor Richard's Almanac made it easy for him to produce pamphlets to a wide range of audience, as well as practice the printing of paper money, which was not too different from the printing of newspapers. There are many quotes that are found of Franklin talking about the conditions of the colonies after paper money's plentiful use before the Currency Act. Before acts of Franklin giving reasons as money for the reason for the Revolution, he was found talking about the plentifulness of exchange the colonies had from paper money. Quote,
There was an abundance in the colonies. Peace was reigning over every boy. It was difficult and even impossible to find a happier, more prosperous nation on all the surface of the globe. Comfort was prevailing in every home. People in general kept the highest moral standards, and education was widely spread.
When letters are met back and forth between Franklin and his friends in England, they spoke of terrible economic conditions due to England having too many workers. Taxes from the rich did little to alleviate some of the needs of poverty of the mass workers. Franklin's friends would ask him how the colonies would manage to collect enough money to support their poorhouses, and how they would overcome this plague of pauperism. Franklin replied,
They have no poorhouses in the colonies, and if we had some, there would be nobody to put them, since there is in the colonies not a single unemployed person, neither beggar nor tramps.
In a meeting with merchants and bankers at the British Board of Trade, members asked Franklin how American colonies managed to collect enough money to support their poor. Franklin replied,
That is simple. In the colonies we issue our own money. It's called colonial scrip. We issue it in proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay no one.
According to Peter Cooper, who served as vice president of the New York Board of Currency, claims prior to the Revolution, paper money was known as colonial scrip, quoting, colonial treasury notes, and this currency was receivable and accepted by several provinces for everything the governments accepted as taxes. These colonial scrips were adapted by nearly every colonies, which led to an unexpected degree of prosperity. Cooper further explains in his book, Ideas for Science of a Good Government, the financial advantages to paper over gold being paper money rose 2 and 3% over par, gold and silver, which is why most colonies preferred its use. Colonies enjoyed advantages such as security against theft, and because paper money could easily be hidden, as well as easily carried compared to hard currencies.
Franklin was so inspired, he wrote these notions down. And with his Little Richard's Almanac, he was able to print all these pamphlets. And it's really interesting because we see his head on the $100 bill. And basically, he's printing Benjamins to his friends. I mean, when you think about it, how crazy is that if I was like, hey, Dr. Mercantini, yeah, it's cool you go work my newspaper thing. You want a few Matthews for your troubles? So it's really interesting how that notion, it was completely an entrepreneurial thing. You're printing your money, you're making businesses, and you're stabilizing the economy. He saw how it stabilized the entire state of Pennsylvania. And so not only did Franklin, this is my primary source of using that he not only paid people with his money, that he knew that this was actually something that stabilized and was something that was almost a protest to England. he's showing that money was a really big contention for the war. The Currency Acts originally were putting pressure from Parliament from British merchants who were not being honored in specie or hard currencies. They're going, we don't want this paper money. We want it to be honored with gold, you know? Oh, want me bloody gold, you know? And that's pretty much where the Currency Acts got pressure from, was merchants not being honored.
And no one was more devoted to the British crown than our own Benjamin Franklin.
He felt that the British Empire, politically speaking, was the best thing going. It afforded the greatest protection for rights, the greatest scope for individual ambitions and opportunities. Franklin eventually would be forced to change his mind, but it would require a real identity crisis in Franklin.
Ben's evolution from royalist to rebel would play out over some 30 years and mirror the changes that shaped America. From the 1740s to the early 1760s, Ben and his fellow colonists were staunchly British, fighting a common battle against France and its Indian allies in the wilds of North America. The conflicts culminated in what is known today as the French and Indian War. When French raiders penetrate to within 50 miles of Philadelphia, Franklin raises a militia to defend British interests. Later, he and his son William restore British control to frontier towns decimated by Indian attacks.
You don't think of Franklin as a military guy. But in the 1750s, when the Indians are terrorized, he and William go off to the frontier, and with this voluntary militia, they help build a line of forts that try to protect Pennsylvania from the marauding Indians.
In 1757, Franklin left the simmering conflict for London. He had been selected as the agent, or lobbyist, representing Pennsylvania's assembly before Parliament. In addition to his official duties, Ben had personal business to attend to, business befitting a prominent citizen of the British Empire.
Franklin was very serious about getting a land grant in the West, and he brought together a lot of powerful political leaders and bankers of London into a syndicate that was going to try to get a land grant. So, as usual with Franklin, there's all sorts of interrelated and conflicting interests as he goes about his business.
Once in England, Franklin would even seek a post as Undersecretary of a British ministry. Larger events would force him to reconsider his allegiance. The catalyst was the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. Britain had won, but its treasury was depleted.
The British had spent a lot of money defending the colonies in the French and Indian War, so they wanted to raise some taxes in order to pay for it. The Americans understood the need to help pay for these wars, but they wanted the right to impose their own taxes instead of having the Parliament in England impose the taxes.
The Stamp Act, passed in 1765, required Americans to pay taxes on just about every scrap of paper they used, from playing cards to court documents and newspapers. Franklin opposed the measure in principle, but did little to lobby against its passage.
At times, he wasn't fully aggressive enough. He didn't oppose the Stamp Act strongly enough for his constituents back in Pennsylvania because he saw himself as a loyal subject. He wanted a royal appointment. He wanted the land grant. And that, in some ways, helped separate him from the more radical sentiment back in the colonies.
The Stamp Act was greeted with outright violence, with acts of, well, what other people might call political terrorism. The stamp agents were in some cases tarred and feathered. The supporters of the British government had their houses torn down, and they themselves were sometimes ridden out of town on a rail. Franklin found himself caught out on the wrong foot here.
In America, Franklin's reputation plummeted. One political cartoon even depicted him as an agent of the devil.
Now, he quickly had to try to align himself a little bit more with what the position in America was, if only to be an effective mediator between the Americans and the British. But he still believed that reason could bring the two sides back together, because he thought it would be a tremendous shame and a great loss to Americans, to the British, to the world at large, if the British Empire fell apart.
On February 13, 1766, Franklin appears before Parliament and argues forcefully against the Stamp Act. 9 days later, Parliament rescinds the measure.
His testimony against the Stamp Act was the single most important thing that convinced the English government that it had to repeal the act. It also was the single most important thing to making Franklin the premier spokesman for the colonies and restoring his reputation back in America.
The Stamp Act episode left Franklin questioning his loyalties to England.
Here's something that you said with the, I actually would want you to elaborate on this. So it says like how the currency acts definitely were a factor, but on top of the sugar and stamp acts, also being needed to be paid in gold and silver.
Yeah, and I mean that's with the Sugar Act and with the Stamp Act particularly. That's one of the big complaints about it, is because the amount of money to actually be collected under the Stamp Act isn't that great.
No,
it makes a big it's a big increase because the British government was collecting very, very little prior to that, and so it's a big increase. It's going directly to the British as opposed to going to the provincial governments or the local governments. But it's also that it has to be collected in specie, and it's incredibly difficult to come up with that. You actually have a pretty good medium of exchange through this barter system, and then paper currency. There's a lot of paper currency that's printed during the French and Indian War, and so that creates a lot of economic advantage during that period, and then immediately after in 1763 and 1764. But among the big complaints with the Stamp Act is that it had to be paid in gold and silver, and it was very hard to come by, and so you're going to be a tax cheat just because you can't come up with it in silver is a problem. But the silver all flowed it flowed all to England. It flowed back across the Atlantic.
Right, and it goes to show you that, like, even though I could say as much as I want that it had to do with money and whatever, and it did, it just wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just the currency act.
It's complicated, but the Currency Act is part of this larger. It's part of the larger plan that the British government has for the economy, and particularly the economy in its colonies. And in 1764, I mean those two dates, 1751 and 1764, are important because from between 1748 and 1754, the British government is trying to kind of have a stronger control over the colonies, really for the first time.
Right. And
then that gets set aside when the goal has to be to defeat the French in the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War, whatever you want to call it. But then in 1764, the war is over, and so they go back to those goals of saying, look, the colonies are thriving economically; they're strong enough to be able to bear some of this, and so, but also we need to be making more money off of the colonies. Right. And so those dates line up. I mean, it makes sense. It gets back to your point, right? I mean, this is actually the life on the ground, and that can be hard to capture. But what is it? What is it like to not be liquid?
What do you mean not be liquid?
And to not have cash. I mean, we take cash for granted now, and so to not have that, I mean, a lot of times you're just kind of exchanging through barter, right? If you look at a lot of stuff, there's not cash to exchange to exchange, and so at the end of the year, whatever we have these records, whatever you bought all of these things from the local store, and then you paid back with firewood, you paid back with these supplies, you paid back with this additional labor that you performed, and it balances out every year. Sometimes it would go for multiple years. So the lack of a paper currency was a real stressor.
Right.
It was.
It's a good point you brought that up, because even Virginia did like a commodity dollars where they used tobacco notes because they had such low.
South Carolina is doing the same thing. I mean, they're constantly kind of printing it, printing paper money, using paper money, but also manipulating it.
Right.
It's kind of a way to avoid raising taxes, as a way to say we're gonna just issue this paper money and
Yeah.
and that'll get us over get us over this hump and it's the South Carolina economy is strong enough because of the commodities that they don't have too much of an inflationary worry until it gets to
Right.
to a certain level.
It's like, oh, we'll just print it so we don't have to tax you and make you as mad, right? It's kind of very similar. Like even today, we still have that going on.
Well, it certainly is the
politicians.
case in the Civil. It's
Right.
the case in the Civil War, and the North is able to do it. I mean, the North prints money, but they print it responsibly, and their economy is strong enough to kind of back it up. I mean, and the South just kind of prints it, willy-nilly, and because they don't have the ability to levy taxes beyond a certain point, they don't have the ability to borrow money beyond a certain point.
Right.
And so that's where you get into those really crazy inflationary pressures.
It's amazing how like it goes from right through the Revolution, Civil War. Like it's a consistent like theme that keeps happening.
For sure.
One of the real things was the Articles of Confederation didn't really give power for the federal government to tax. That was one of the real contentions of it, and why the new banking system, when I get to the first bank of the United States, really was an experiment of a new power of the federal government.
And it's New Jersey that's that's really the first state. So I mean, under the Articles of Confederation, basically the federal government asked nicely to the states for them to pay them.
Right.
And New Jersey, in I think it's 1785, is really the first state to say, we're not paying.
Wow.
What are you going to do about it?
Typical Jersey attitude.
And it's more complicated than that because New Jersey doesn't have the ports of Philadelphia and New York are collecting a lot of the money, and New Jersey goods are being shipped out of those ports, and New Jersey's not seeing the tax revenue coming in because tariffs are being collected by the states instead of the federal government. So it's part of a larger manipulation by New Jersey to get to where we get to with the Constitution, where the federal government is going to kind of collect this stuff and New Jersey benefits. But yeah, it's New Jersey in 1785 that the federal government comes and says your tax levy that you're owed based on your size and population or whatever is this, and New Jersey's like, yeah, we're not paying.
That's amazing. I had no idea about that. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for a little knowledge nugget.
Franklin was brought to Parliament and was asked about the cause of the wondrous prosperity growing in the colonies. Franklin simply stated the cause of the convenience the colonies found was in exchanging various forms of services for paper money that was adapted. Soon after Franklin's statements and his return to America, the first issuance by Parliament was enacted with the Currency Act of 1751. England knew for certain paper money had the power to threaten the British control over the wealth in the colonies. Before paper money's adoption, there was another alternative money that was used in English history that threatened England's power over the money supply. Before the American colonies experimented with their interest-free colonial scrips, threatening Great Britain's Bank of England's monopoly on the money supply, there was the tally stick. They were essentially humble sticks of willow wood, no bigger than from a man's thumb to his index finger, or 20 centimeters long. Around 1100, son of William the Conqueror, Henry I, got tired of goldsmiths hoarding massive amounts of gold affecting the British economy. Henry created a unique money system called the tally sticks. The tally sticks were originally used as record of semi-annual tax payments. Since taxes were a necessity, tally sticks circulated as a normal, real form of money, kind of like its successor, paper money, in Massachusetts in 1690. Tally sticks, or tallies, were a way of recording debts with a system that was simple and effective, in that these sticks kept track of money on the stick itself, acting as a ledger without needing the requirements of one. Notches of a certain size and writing were cut into the stick, representing not only the amount, but the payment or debt to certain individuals and businesses. The stick was split down the middle, and its length containing the debt carved into the wood. The debtor would retain half, called the foil. The creditor would retain the other half, called the stock. This is where we get the modern term for stock nowadays, a phrase in England more referred to for British debts. If the debtor was not good for the money, the stock of the tally stick itself was worth close to its value of the money and could be sold for thus. Tally sticks never replaced gold. That was always money for the rich. But for the poor, the farmer, everyone else, the tally sticks were good for exchange, for markets, and more convenient than bartering or using cattle or property. In fact, after the Bank of England's establishment in 1694, the bank tried to sabotage the tally stick system in that it became a threat because it was money outside the banking system's power. The British Empire was built on the tally stick system, giving prosperity exchange to the British economy for hundreds of years. And one of the original shareholders in the Bank of England purchased his original shares with a tally stick worth over 25,000 British pounds.
Here I have one of the few surviving examples of this form of British money, which lasted 726 years until 1826, a tally stick. The tally system was adopted to avoid the monetary manipulation of the goldsmiths.
Tally sticks were money fabricated out of sticks of polished wood. Notches were cut along one edge of the stick to indicate the denominations.
Then the stick was split lengthwise through the notches so that both pieces still had a record of the notches.
The king kept one half to protect against counterfeiting. Then he would spend the other half into the economy and they would circulate as money. This particular tally stick is huge. It represented 25,000 pounds. One of the original stockholders in the Bank of England purchased his original shares with this stick. In other words, he bought shares in the world's richest and most powerful corporation with a stick of wood.
This was acceptable money, only having significant decline in the 17th century. After the tally stick, there was not another sizable threat to the Bank of England until the development of paper money by the 13 colonies. Understanding the influence of the Bank of England and its history on the colonies, and understanding that money was the prime reason for the Revolutionary War, will forever change one's perspective on the war, as well as America as a nation. Paper money was an escape from England and the controlled money supply of Bank of England. Paper money's influence was the rebellious identity and trademark of the colonies. They say truth is stranger than fiction. Well, sometimes history is stranger than fiction and much more addicting. Next time on Hidden Hands of History, we'll talk about the West Indies and its importance to the Revolution, as well as the genius of Alexander Hamilton, his background, and his influence as the architect of the first bank of the United States, his struggle in the Panic of 1792, as well as John Kean's cashier receipts, U.S. debt, international treaties that all affected tensions between our country, Great Britain, that lasted long after the Revolution leading into the War of 1812. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something. All the information was taken and dedicated to the Kean Foundation from Kean University at Liberty Hall.